I'm really happy and more than honored to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, Dr.
Recording in progress.
Dr. Richard Muneng is UNEP's Deputy Director for Africa and also our Regional Coordinator for Climate Change, and he will be moderating the different discussions for today's webinar. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oscar, and welcome to everyone who's joining this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. All protocols observed. Today, we gathered to discuss our understanding of loss and damage in Africa, the science, the policy, as well as the mechanisms to avert and minimize and address impacts. But this African proverb sums it up so nicely that never travel with a friend who deserts you at the notice of danger. We convene here as friends of Africa at a time when the dangers of climate change for the continent have never been more real and clear for us all. But our convening here is a testament that we are real friends of the continent and stand with her at this hour of need. The principle of loss and damage provides the clearest indicator of the continuing dangers of climate change to the most vulnerable, the majority of them in the African continent. And it is about climate risk that exceeds the limits of adaptation for a continent where adaptation have not been fully covered. Loss and damage, therefore, presents a far much worse risk because climate adaptation investments are underfinanced by up to 6 times as we speak today. And considering the loss and damage risk exceeds these staggering figures, the urgency for action is unprecedented. Therefore, this discussion today will address the highest level of climate risk and the big question that will be answered by this webinar today will be, will we continue standing with Africa in this hour of need as true friends? We'll find out shortly. I will then invite Alvin Chandra, the Global Coordinator of Adaptation Policy and Partnerships, UNEP, to give his opening remarks in 3 minutes. Over to you, Alvin.
Thank you, Richard. Distinguished participants, panelists, network partners, colleagues and friends, and with all protocols observed, on behalf of UNEP Global Adaptation Network, I'm delighted to welcome you to the webinar today. The webinar is the third of a series of regional awareness initiatives that we've organized to better understand the science, policy, and the practice dimensions of addressing loss and damage. We've held similar webinar for the Asia Pacific and the Latin America, Caribbean regions. And as Richard mentioned, today's webinar aims to broaden and deepen our understanding of the science policy dimensions to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. I'm speaking from Kenya, where we have experienced a multi-year drought. Similarly, we've experienced and seen the record-breaking tropical cyclone Freddy in the continent. Freddy had resulted in a death toll exceeding 300 people across Madagascar, Mozambique, and Malawi. More than 700 people were injured and tens of thousands were displaced. So the impacts of climate-related loss and damage are more than just visible. Rather, they are felt and experienced by the most vulnerable communities and households. We also see many countries in the region, they experience cycles of floods, droughts, storm events, which is resulting in compound and cascading risks. And we also learn from the latest IPCC report that Africa remains one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of climate change. Just to put the stats, as UNEP, the message we are getting is that we need to accelerate investments in mitigation, adaptation, as well as to mobilize assistance to address loss and damage. These can dramatically avert, minimize, and address future loss and damages. It is also crucial to recognize the progress that have been made under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and you'll hear more of this over today's webinar. The Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 outcomes were a breakthrough. Member states collectively agreed to establish a financing mechanism to address loss and damage caused by climate change. And more of this will be talked about in the webinar. Alongside, I do want to stress UNEP's medium-term strategy, direct outcomes, particularly in climate change. These directly contribute to support the countries in the region in many ways. For example, helping the region develop adaptation planning capacity, disseminate and access climate information and early warning system, building awareness on good practices to address climate risks, as well as our efforts to mobilize finance to address current and future risks and impacts. So today's webinar is organized around a series of presentations, and I do welcome your engagement and participation. We hope that this helps to improve an understanding of the needs, priorities of the region so that we together can accelerate climate action. And with these words of welcome, I wish you the best in today's discussion and encourage your participation through the online chat channel. Asante sana. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Alvin, and for putting in perspective and showcasing how the science actually is already manifesting itself through Cyclone Freddy. That, of course, lives, and also bringing the aspect from COP27, where the loss and damage fund was actually a decision to establish it was crafted. Now, then bring in Mr. Richard Sheman, the member of the South African delegation to the UNFCCC and the Africa Group Lead Coordinator on Climate Finance Negotiation. Over to you, Richard, to shed some light in 3 minutes on these aspects.
Thank you very much, Richard. And let me first of all thank UNEP for its continued leadership and working with the African region, civil society, African governments and negotiators to bring us here. We look forward to seeing you again in Amsterdam next month, in Addis, and we hope that the ministers will give strong support to the establishment or the further operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. So briefly, I think we need to assess, quite frankly, where we are. We're 7 years away from the 2030 target, 43% emissions reductions from all countries. It looks impossible. It seems that we are struggling politically at the negotiations level on agreeing about agenda items rather than talking about action. At the same time, we're 7 years away from the SDG targets, and the work coming out of the analysis done by Jeffrey Sachs's group is suggesting that hardly any countries, maybe 1 or 2 at the most, will meet the full scale of the SDG. So in fact, what we have, and at the same time, we're having political negotiations of how to quantify the global goal and adaptation with sub-targets. At the same time, we must conclude that not only is there a finance gap of billions and trillions, as you said, Richard, but there's also a confidence gap and a trust gap. And therefore, exercises like what we had in Sharm el-Sheikh by establishing a new fund and then tasking a small committee of governments to draft the fund and put it in place is actually an opportunity to address both the finance gap as well as the trust and the confidence gap. As co-chair of the Transitional Committee, we've taken it very seriously as Africa to deliver on this. And we'll update you later on our progress. I just want to finally restate what Alvin had really clearly said, is that loss and damage is happening now. It's not a future event. The targets for adaptation and mitigation are future looking. So therefore, we have to address what's happening to us now. It's happening all over the world. It's equally disrupting all developing countries and disenabling us to meet our economic goals and our poverty reduction goals. And therefore, it's incumbent on us to go to UAE COP28 and ensure that there's a full package of outcomes. It doesn't help us to just have an outcome on loss and damage fund, but we need to have strong action on mitigation, strong action on adaptation, and strong action on loss and damage. So I'll leave my opening remarks at that point. We look forward to the discussion with colleagues from the continent, and please reach out to your members on the Transitional Committee that are representing Africa. We will not fail you in our task. Thank you, Richard.
The negotiations addressing the confidence gap as well as the trust gap to be able to address the finance aspects. And Richard highlighted, loss and damage is happening now, just as Alvin indicated, using the example of Cyclone Freddy. And therefore, strong action on mitigation, strong action for adaptation needs to actually take place. I think What we're going to do now is just to take 6 minutes and have an interactive session as an icebreaker, and then we will get straight into understanding loss and damage from a policy science interface. Over to you, Oscar, for the interactive session.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And so as Richard just explained, just for the few next minutes, we will have a few questions for all of you. So I would invite you to go to the platform called Menti. You just want to go on menti.com and to enter the following code 53178912 in order to then join this Menti. And then we will just have a few questions just to get to know you a little bit better, and also for you to just share a little bit more about your experience with loss and damage, which is a very critical topic in the region. So let's start with, first of all, where are you joining us from? So which country are you joining us from? Where are you currently based in, or where do you work? So we would love to know exactly where. So as you can see, already a lot of different countries are being shared. A lot of people from South Africa. Surprisingly, a lot of people from Denmark as well. It's always great to have people from all around the world. And then we have a little bit of more people from Europe as well. I see France, I see the United Kingdom. Of course, I see a lot of African countries, Nairobi. I know that a lot of colleagues are joining as well from Nairobi. So we have really a good variety. Kenya is, without a surprise, also a big country, as a lot of people are currently based here within UNEP. So it's great, again, to see so many people from all around the world joining. And I'm really glad to see, again, that we're able to bring everyone together to start these important discussions. So now I'll move to the second questions. The other question is, how familiar are you with loss and damage? So as you can see, you can choose between very familiar, basic knowledge, or not familiar at all. So we're hoping that either if you are someone with a lot of knowledge on loss and damage, you will still be able to learn something from today's discussions, and especially something about loss and damage in Africa and what we can do in order to scale up this important work. So I see that most people are in between familiar and basic knowledge, which is good. It means that you will still be able to participate actively in today's discussions, but also to learn a lot. I see that a few people don't really have any knowledge for now, which is, again, very good. You're here to discover this topic, and hopefully you'll be able to learn a lot. And then we have a few people who are very familiar with this topic. So again, during the discussions, if you have examples you want to share, you can use the chat option, you can use the Q&A, and it's great to also get to know a little bit more from colleagues who already have a lot of experience in this field. So I'm just going to leave a few more seconds so people can share some answers to this question. I see that we have 83 participants who are joining on Menti, which is really, really nice. So I think now we're going to move on the third question, but we can see that most people are between familiar and basic knowledge, which is great. And so the last question is, what is the key area of technical assistance your country and organization or community needs to basically scale up loss and damage? So as you can see, the different options include technical, financial, institutional, legislative, regulatory, education or awareness, human resources, or maybe this is something else. If this is something else, you can also share it in the chat, and like that, other participants and other colleagues can see what are other needs that you have when it comes to loss and damage. So I think we can see that some of the main areas are, of course, financial. There is a lot in terms of education and awareness, which is very interesting indeed, trying to close as much as possible knowledge gaps and trying to make sure that people are aware is one of the first priority. Then there is quite a lot also in terms of institutional, legislative, and regulatory. We have a couple of panelists and also participants who are from different institutions and governmental agencies, so it will be great also to hear from you. And then there is quite a lot also on technical. So I think overall, it's pretty safe to say that it's all a little bit equal. Human resources doesn't seem to be really a big area, but financial, education, awareness are definitely 2 points that we will touch on today during the discussions. So that's pretty much it for this really short Q&A session with all of you. And now I'll hand it over to you, to Richard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for that icebreaker. And also the Mentimeter have showcased the aspect of finance quite very, very essential. Just as Richard said and Alvin said, it's a key aspect, but it needs the confidence and the faith gap to be closed, and also the dimension of education and awareness. We will now get into understanding loss and damage from a science policy perspective, and a colleague, Anne, from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the next 10 minutes will take us through so we can be able to understand loss and damage under the UNFCCC background history, the progress and the gaps to date. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Richard. And if I could ask for my presentation to be up. Now, thanks to all the participants for joining us. I've been assigned a somewhat ungrateful task of telling you everything about loss and damage under the UNFCCC process in under 10 minutes. So forgive me if the presentation seems a bit rushed.
I'll share it in 1 second, sorry.
Yeah. We will be starting with a picture with the hopes that given that a picture, next slide.
Yes.
Yeah, hoping that a picture will be worth 1,000 words and help me expedite a bit. But while there is no official definition of loss and damage under the UNFCCC, loss and damage is generally understood as the negative impacts of climate change that have not or could not been adapted to. And some of the distinctions that are quite important at the negotiations level are those between slow onset events, which are those that are defined by the UNFCCC as developing gradually over time, with impacts often based on a confluence of several different events, such as, for example, desertification, land and forest degradation, and extreme weather events, which are defined by the IPCC as whether those that are rare at a particular time and place, but that have more immediate devastating consequences. Another important distinction is that between economic losses, which are those that are resources, goods, or services that are usually traded in markets, and non-economic losses that can be understood as other less difficult to quantify items, but that are still a source of quite important value, like, for example, the loss of life, the loss of traditional culture and knowledge. Next slide. Now here we can see the evolution and the chronology of loss and damage under the UNFCCC process. And while loss and damage has been present in the negotiations even before the convention itself was adopted, it was first part of a negotiated outcome in 2007, with the institutionalization starting really with the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism, COP19 in 2013. This has initiated a phase of setting up institutional arrangements and launching of technical work that culminated with the inclusion of loss and damage as a separate article under the Paris Agreement, Article 9, the establishment of the certain task forces and expert groups, or the establishment of the Santiago Network at COP25. And now we're slowly entering what has been defined as a new phase of catalyzing support at the country level. And maybe the most emblematic development here is the establishment of funding arrangements and a fund with the Sharm decision. Next slide. But looking at, let's say, the history of it, the Warsaw International Mechanism was the fulcrum of this institutionalization of loss and damage under the UNFCCC. And it is the main vehicle under the UNFCCC process to really address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries. Next slide. It has three functions. On enhancing knowledge, strengthening dialogue and coordination, and enhancing action and support. Next slide. And it has right now quite a developed institutional structure with the establishment of the Santiago Network that I have mentioned before on providing technical assistance with the Fiji clearinghouse for risk transfer, and also with the executive committee, which has the which was established together with the Warsaw International Mechanism, and which has the important role of ensuring the implementation of the function of the mechanism through its work plans. Next slide. Now here we see a bit more in detail the institutional arrangements of the executive committee itself. And the executive committee reports back yearly to the UNFCCC on the implementation of the functions of the Warsaw International Mechanism, as aided in this work by 5 expert groups, one under each of its strategic work streams. So right now it is a fully developed institutional structure where for each strategic work stream, for example, in human mobility, there's quite an active task force on displacement. On comprehensive risk management approaches, the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management on slow onset events. We have an expert group. We have an expert group dedicated to non-economic losses and an expert group on action and support. And what is quite important is that all of these expert groups have their own dedicated plans of action that contributes to the implementation of the overall 5-year rolling work plan of the EXCOM. Next slide. And if we look at the key outcomes of COP27, these have been quite important, not just with the decision on the establishment of the fund and funding arrangements, but have really signified a shift on the work on loss and damage under the UNFCCC in many ways. For the WIM-EXCOM, we have parties have endorsed the second 5-year rolling work plan of the EXCOM, the second plan of action of the TEC CRM, and also the third plan of action of the TFD. And these are all important because they signify a shift towards working much more intensely on providing technical guidance to countries and implementing the mandate on technical guides that the WIM-EXCOM has received from COP25. On the Santiago network side of things, we have mature institutional arrangements now, which have been endorsed by parties at COP27. And the COP27 had also established quite a specific process for the selection of a host for the Santiago network. And then, of course, the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements don't really need an introduction. Next slide. And talking a bit more in detail on the Santiago network, it was established, as we have seen, at COP25, and it really aims to catalyze technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies and networks and experts for the implementation of approaches to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage at different levels, including national and local levels. And the Secretariat, in this interim period, while we are waiting for a selection of a host, the Secretariat has the mandate to continue to support developing countries that may seek technical assistance. Next slide. And while parties have strengthened the Santiago network at COP26 by agreeing on its functions, and at COP27 on the institutional structure, there were high expectations for COP28 and prior at SB 58 on the selection of a host. But unfortunately, with the fact that at SB 58 parties were not able to come to an agreement regarding a host, the full operationalization of the Santiago network is now expected to be at least slightly delayed, but we're hoping that it will come to fruition at COP28. Next slide. And this is just an example of some of the activities that the Secretariat of the UNFCCC is undertaking in the interim. Next slide. Now, quickly on the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements, these were, of course, famously established at COP27, but prior to this, at COP26, there was the establishment of a Glasgow dialogue, which provided a platform that allowed, in its first session, parties to highlight concrete gaps in the current funding and funding arrangements. And now with the establishment of the funding arrangements and fund, and the establishment of a transitional committee for the operationalization, which has been tasked in preparing recommendations to be adopted at COP28 CMA 5, the Glasgow dialogue itself has become part of this path towards this operationalization. And next slide. This is really just to give you a visual of where we are at the moment. The transitional committee in the decision from Sharm has in front of itself a very clear path of a series of appointments and a series of occasions to really discuss and help it craft recommendations that will consider both the institutional arrangements of the funds, the elements of the funding arrangements, the sources of funding, and coordination and complementarity issues. And we're really halfway through now after the Glasgow Dialogue. And if we can just go to the next slide. The Glasgow Dialogue just took place at SB 58, and now with the Sharm decision, one of its mandates is really to inform the work of the Transitional Committee, and discussions that have taken place have focused on the operationalization of the new fund and funding arrangements, as well as maximizing the support for existing funding arrangements. And the SBI chair is currently in the process of finalizing its summary report, which will be published next week and which will hopefully further contribute to inform the work of the Transitional Committee. And just the last slide, this is to give you a visual of what the expectations are looking ahead towards COP28. We're expecting to have an endorsement of the recommendations of the Transitional Committee regarding the funding arrangements and fund. On the technical assistance side of things, we're hoping that COP28 will lead to a selection of a host for the Santiago network, but we will also probably have some interim provisions for the support to be provided to countries. The EXCOM report of this year will also be adopted, and we are expecting that the issue of the WIM governance will remain unresolved as it is now. I hope I have been quite close to time. I have measured myself, it's 11 minutes, so sorry for this, but I'll leave it at this. If you have any questions, I will be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that succinct and very elaborate presentation that have actually brought out a historical journey 30 years ago when loss and damage first surfaced, and culminating as a highlight of COP27, which was a historic moment for the first time to address loss and damage and take the concrete step of setting up a fund. We've also highlighted the issue and how it further developed into the WASO implementation mechanism, which promoted actions to address loss and damage. Over 9 years ago, and at COP19, it was included in Article 8 of the Paris Agreement at COP21, and that was 7 years ago, and at COP26 in 2021, the implementation of action to address loss and damage was still contested. But there is progress. This then takes me now to the discussion of the Loss and Damage Fund, which my friend Richard Schiman, the co-chair of the Transitional Committee and member of the South African delegation to the UNFCCC Africa Group lead coordinators on climate finance negotiation, will take us through in 10 minutes and give us the understanding of how the establishment and operationalization of this new funding arrangement is happening and what is needed actually to be done and what is expected to happen at COP28. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. So, as Anna had said, we had the very important decision in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a fund. So the fund exists. It just doesn't have, it's a skeletal body, right? But it exists, and it exists just in name. The Transitional Committee process is a function of how we established funds in the past. So you establish the fund, you then establish a Transitional Committee to transition from that decision to an operationalization decision, which is what we meant to achieve at COP28. The decision spoke very clearly to both a fund and funding arrangements. It also spoke very clearly to coordination and complementarity across the entire multilateral system that is dealing with components of humanitarian response, disaster response, economic recovery, it's the MDBs, and reconstruction issues. It also spoke that we needed to deal with the issue of sources. I mean, in that case, it spoke very clearly about not just the traditional sources on the obligation of developed countries to contribute, but also looking at innovative sources. And so those are the four main occupations that we have. The fifth thing that it said to us is go and look at the gaps. So we've spent a lot of time this year so far looking at gaps in the institutions, gaps in the priorities. It's unlikely that we're going to resolve anything beyond saying there's a financing gap, there's a delivery gap, and there's an architectural gap, right? And so those are the sort of 5 components that structure our work. As Anna had said, we're probably halfway through the 20 days that we were given to design this. And I think this is an important feature. We don't have to answer all the questions. We have to take the decision from Sharm el-Sheikh to the point in United Arab Emirates where the fund can actually start working. So in other words, we have a secretariat, we have a board, we have some resources, we have some purpose, and the COP will give then or delegate then the responsibility of defining the programming priorities, what the fund does, how it works beyond a very vague mandate. So what we will end up giving the COP to consider, and we hope that once we conclude our work, it's not reopened and the COP just adds the political impetus around resources for the fund, is I would say a compartmentalized decision, one that talks to the fund, and that set of recommendation will probably be in the form of a terms of reference that will include the role of the board, the role of the secretariat, what are the initial principles and priorities and scope and objectives, and then we'll discuss very generically how you access the fund, how we deal with stakeholders, how we deal with the nation states who has the obligation to mitigate and adapt and to address loss and damage. We'll deal very superficially on issues of reporting, on standards and safeguards, et cetera, et cetera. We believe this is very, very achievable. The core component in this discussion, or the underlying component, is: are we setting up a new institution? So is this a new institution that will be established at COP28, or are we using existing institutions, almost like what they did at CBD COP15, where they put the fund within the Global Environment Facility? And so we're busy looking at all these various options. There is no perfect option, right? The perfect option is only the one that delivers finance to developing countries in a rapid and easily accessible manner. And so part of this, part is balancing the need for an efficient, responsive, rapid fund versus the other sort of mechanical legal issues that we will get to that we haven't resolved for the other fund. So we expect that to be delivered, and we hope to make progress in Bangkok in the next 2 weeks at our next workshop. Developing countries have already made a submission as a collective group on the transitional committee on what we expect from the fund. The second component of the decision will be this thing called the funding arrangements. Now, the funding arrangements really talk about normative policy practice to other institutions. So, for example, we probably can envisage a whole set of recommendations to the multilateral development banks, to the international creditors and developed countries that hold the debt of developing countries around debt suspension clauses, et cetera, et cetera. So the funding arrangements are generally what we as the parties say to other institutions that are not COP-based institutions. So for another example is the issue of non-economic losses. We know there's a UNESCO, the World Educational, Scientific and Cultural Body, has a UNESCO World Heritage Fund and looks at protecting World Heritage sites. So are we in a position to now make a recommendation to UNESCO to say, consider a loss and damage action window within your fund that can support non-economic losses, or even in the case of protection of valuable ancestral resources or manners which to commemorate or to record these things. So that's generally what the funding arrangements will be. They're not going to be binding on those institutions, and there's a very big discussion within the transitional committee on how to measure, monitor, and track any of those recommendations.
Richard.
Yeah.
Yes, proceed, Richard. We lost you
okay,
a bit
sorry.
here.
So the third component of the decision is going to be the transitional arrangements, further transitional arrangements. So if, for example, we are establishing a new institution, which is the preferred option of developing countries, then we need time. We will probably need a year before we need an interim secretariat to help the board establish the new secretariat, right? So what we are talking about a process for next year. So the fund will probably be operational in terms of being able to assist developing countries, probably I would assume the earliest in 2025, which is a delay, but if we choose the option of a new institution. If we choose the option of putting it in an existing institution, you're looking at maybe 4 to 5 months, because the decision would be subject to the governing body of that institution, as we had with the CBD. So that's really where we are. The work is progressing slowly and methodically, but I think it's the right chance, the right scope that we're taking. I think the final thing I want to end on is where we need support from our colleagues in the continent, is really understanding how the fund works directly with local communities or local civil society actors, because the existing funds have failed to do this. Beyond the small grants fund, which is successful, but it's a very small amount, we don't really have a working model. People look at the global fund, HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, but they're also concerned about that. Really interested in hearing from the continent as to how you would like to see this fund respond rapidly and efficiently to support local affected communities. And then the last point that's really important, and I had a meeting with some of the colleagues in the Kenyan government that are working on the African Climate Summit, and I made a recommendation that can we ask President Ruto to stipulate in his letter of invitation to heads of state, they come to Nairobi with money, with pledges for the loss and damage fund, because this is going to be the most crucial aspect. And particularly, we understand the economic context of developed countries, but we need money, and we need even just a little bit of money to get more money. And so this will be a fund that starts off small, evolves over time, and is adaptive to the changing context of climate change.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that, Richard. We're looking forward to hearing from colleagues on their views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. You've succinctly explained this from when the fund was established at COP27 to the transitional committee looking to operationalize funds, including funding sources that go beyond traditional sources, include innovative sources. And you've highlighted COP28 is to consider a decision on both the fund operationalization and the organizational structure. And a key question is, will there be a new institution? I think that is really where the rubber hits the road, as you've highlighted, or an existing institution will be leveraged. But most importantly, is that the fund must be accessible to deliver funding to developing countries and especially to communities, and funding arrangements to engage non-institutions to finance loss and damage, including multilateral institutions. But one aspect that you've mentioned that I would like to just use 1 minute just to ask you this question. From lessons learned from GCF, the Adaptation Fund, the operationalization of some of these funds takes about 7 years. But when the news of the creation of the decision to create this loss and damage fund surfaced in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was exuberance and excitement across the world. Do you think that exuberance should dampen, given that from what you've explained, we're looking at 2025, but loss and damage is happening now?
So either of the options that we look at have pros and cons, right? And so this is now going to be a trade-off of whether we want a fund that's starting now in 2024, or whether we're prepared to go a little bit slow, not too slowly, and make sure that it has money by 2025. And this is where the choice is do we want, are we going to be serviced by the GEF operating as the loss and damage fund? I don't think so. Will the GCF be able to do it? I don't think so. Will the World Bank be able to do it? It could do that, but then you're going into, you're simply having to go now from a COP decision to a World Bank board decision, and that takes time. I think the real questions that we've learned is we don't have to start from scratch. We're not reinventing the wheel. What we have to do is find a new way of delivering money to finance investments, whatever it is, to impacted communities as it's happening. So they're dealing with the relief, the rehabilitation, the recovery, and the rebuilding. It's really important. But again, as I said, if you don't resolve the mitigation gap and the adaptation gap, you're making our job much harder. So in the absence of political will, we are talking about a fund that needs to be set up from scratch because of the enormity of the task. So I'm not dampened, but I'm pretty sure that the communities that are affected will probably disagree with me. They want value now, and so we have to make that choice of what we do next. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. That beautifully takes us to the panel discussion, where we're going to actually be looking at the gaps in finance for addressing this loss and damage and how these can be addressed by new funding structures, which you've beautifully articulated. But you did mention something, Richard, which now takes us to this panel discussion on the trust and confidence gap, which will then take this down to a panel. And a panelist, we have eminent panelists, people in their own right that are going to contribute ideas that will help us understand how we can avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We have Mr. Mark, we have Samuel, we have Dr. Lufonso, we have Malvin, and we have Madame Adama. But without much ado, we've all heard from the presentation, the opening remarks, and to the transitional committee that is in place to be able to formulate and come up with recommendations of what is needed to constitute and put in place the loss and damage, as Richard have beautifully said. But what we saw from the multimeter, the Zoom poll, one of the highest scores was on finance. I would like to start off in this panel discussion with Dr. Olufonso. On Thursday, 29th June, last week, you published an article in the Business Daily Africa. Title is Climate Financing in Africa Adequate and Effective? And you indicated in that article, the continent of Africa needs 3 trillion between 2020 and 2030. So in 7 years from now, we're supposed to be providing about 277 billion, but the continent receives just barely about 30 billion annually, which is just 11% as you articulated in that article. And you concluded the article with very powerful 2 words, scale and speed. From what you've heard, and Richard did indicate that we must be able to channel financing to the communities that are already suffering loss and damage. Can you explain briefly what you mean by scale and speed in this context?
Thank you, Richard. A very good afternoon to everyone. And this has been an interesting conversation. And thank you to organizers for inviting me. I think in the interest of time, we need to understand that we are talking about a continent today that is dealing with the crisis of climate change at an unprecedented level. And let me put that in a context, into a very useful context. I live in Kenya, and I saw that in the Menti, a lot of people are from Kenya. If you notice in the last 10 years, every last drought was the worst drought in the history of droughts. So the one 2 years ago was drought. The one 2 years before then was the worst drought in the history of drought. So what is happening? We're dealing with a frequency of high severity and highly severe crisis. So you're dealing with, the depth of crisis that is overwhelming many countries. And look, Kenya is not a very, very poor country. Absolutely not. It's a middle-income country, but yet it's still severely impacted by this crisis. And when you compare that to other regions that are much poorer, it's different. So adaptation in that context become a policy priority as well as an operational priority for a lot of the African countries. We've seen this in their NDCs, we've seen this in their NAPs. But then there's a huge challenge when it comes to finance, because the scale of response that we have to invest in must match the scale of crisis that we're dealing with. And when you look at the finance flows, unfortunately, it's not that. So what I meant in the conclusion of that article was we need to do big things within a short period of time. and I think it's very important. We have the intention of doing big things, but unfortunately, we don't have a long time to do them. We need to do big things within a short period of time. And those big things require that we aggregate new strategic partnership with new financial instruments beyond grants and concessional loans into new instrument innovations and bring that to an investment plan, something that is able to crowd in the required partners, not just public sector, but private sector as well, and as well as local communities. And unfortunately, and I want to close with this, unfortunately, most adaptation projects in Africa are actually experiencing the lowest disbursement rates. So even for the money that we have received, we're complaining that it's not enough because adequacy and effectiveness of climate finance are quite linked together. So even for the money that you have received, we're not doing well to be able to deploy them on the ground and to make sure that they trickle down. And that is the challenge. And I think when we get to loss and damage, we must be able to look back and see what has our experience been in adaptation, in mitigation, and finance, and be able to see how do we do things differently going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doc, for that. And I like the aspect you mentioned that the scale of response must match the scale of need. And when you look across the continent, as you've rightly painted the picture using Kenya, the continent is an informal continent, meaning that most of the people, about 80% are in the informal sector. They do not have bank accounts. They actually survive from hand to mouth, as they say. If the amount of money that is needed, using your word, scale matching the need, rapidness matching need, how will this money reach these communities? What would you say, very briefly?
Thank you. Sometimes our response must not necessarily be putting money into people's account. Mm-hmm. But if we can provide what people spend money on, then we will still be solving the problem. In some local communities in rural part of Africa, families, households are spending up to 40% of household income on water. So if you're able to provide that water, and even if they are just spending 10% of their income instead of 40%, you don't have to put that 30% saving in their account, but you're providing the resources that they would have spent money on. So that's one way of solving the problem. But nevertheless, there is a need and value for us to be very inclusive financially and to be able to create assets. So it is very important to look at that. And that's where the role of communities become very important in this.
Wonderful. That beautiful answer takes me to the Gulf of West Africa. Guinea is an extremely vulnerable country, Madam Adama, and I would like to hear from you the loss and damage impacts that you're already seeing in Guinea and the urgent immediate needs of rural communities in your country and how this is being addressed. Briefly, over to you, Madam Adama.
Merci, M. Richard. Je tiens à remercier le public pour ces échanges d'expériences. La République de Guinée est l'un des pays placés en première ligne des conséquences du réchauffement climatique, sans en être responsable. En Guinée, les pertes et dommages font référence après évaluation aux dégâts liés aux effets du changement climatique, tels que les inondations, les vents violents, les graves sécheresses occasionnant les feux de brousse, qui engendrent des pertes en vies humaines, des disparitions des terrains cultivables, des disparitions des infrastructures, la disparition de certaines espèces fauniques et floristiques. Plus les impacts s'intensifient, plus le pays se retrouve financièrement dépassé et parfois contraint de demander une assistance financière et matérielle. Et malgré tous les efforts consentis par les autorités et les partenaires, le pays est toujours confronté à des besoins financiers, techniques et matériels. Pour faire face aux dommages causés par le changement climatique. La République de Guinée reste confrontée à d'énormes difficultés à nos jours. Parce que, en cas de dommages, en cas d'inondation, nous n'avons pas de moyens suffisants pour pouvoir faire face aux besoins de nos populations vulnérables. Aujourd'hui, les besoins immédiats de nos populations vulnérables se situent à plusieurs niveaux. Nous avons le niveau des vivres, parce qu'en cas d'inondation, par exemple, je prends un exemple, en cas d'inondation, la population vulnérable perd déjà les vivres. Ils n'ont pas de quoi manger, de quoi se nourrir, de quoi se vêtir. Ils n'ont pas d'habitat. Donc aujourd'hui, nos besoins immédiats aujourd'hui, parce que tout récemment, au mois de mai, il y a eu même un cas d'inondation qui a impacté une partie, presque toutes les communes. Et pas plus tard que la semaine dernière, nous avons un grand médecin qui a perdu la vie dans l'inondation. Et ces problèmes nous posent, nous n'avons pas de moyens actuels. Parce que c'est vrai que quand il y a inondation, quand il y a dégâts, quand il y a perte de préjudice, les autorités viennent avec les moyens de bord. Mais il reste beaucoup à faire. Aujourd'hui, nos populations ont besoin de moyens de subsistance, ont besoin de premiers soins.
Yes, Madam.
Oui.
Yeah, let me just jump in here. You said the people need a means to livelihood, which is very true. But when you look at Guinea, the fishery sector contributes up to about 3.7% of Guinea's GDP, employing about 200,000 people. And this is critical to enhancing the economic inclusivity in Guinea. But this sector is at risk, as you've said, of this irreversible climate impact. So my question to you is there something being done? To what extent do you think, if you take the fishery sector, do you think value addition solutions, for example, pool storage and solar power drying, will this help build the community resilience from what you are seeing? I would like to get your thoughts in this very briefly.
Oui, cela va beaucoup contribuer à la résilience parce que ça va les permettre à éviter les lieux d'accident. Ça va les permettre à éviter de détruire la mangrove qui est en train de l'inondation, qui est en train de la montée de la mer. Donc, c'est une meilleure solution aujourd'hui. Ça, c'est de nouvelles technologies pour la protection de la mangrove. Donc, c'est l'une des meilleures solutions pour vraiment renforcer notre résilience.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Madam Adama, for that wonderful intervention and also putting in perspective the risk that Benin is already having and feeling. I would now like to go to Mr. Marvin. You work with Africa Risk Climate Capacity. And what we know across the continent from the data that we have is that Africa aggregate insurance penetration rate is estimated at 2.78% in 1 year, which is well below the global average of about 7.23%. And you've heard from Madam Adama, Guinea is already facing loss and damage. You heard from Dr. Olufonso, who talked about scale matching the need that is happening in the continent. What can be done by African countries to have increased accessibility to insurance? I would like to get your thoughts on this.
Thanks very much, Richard. And I don't have time, so I'll skip all the niceties and go straight to the point. So, yes, you're quite right. The protection gap, as they call it, is 97%. So that basically means that, you know, for all the economic losses that are associated with climate events, only 3% are covered. There's downstream impact in terms of so the initial impact on lives and livelihoods, I think, has already been discussed. But there's also downstream impacts for governments in terms of lost revenue, taxes, and also the wiping away, of development gains. So this is a big problem. But I think the other bigger problem that we have is what I call a risk management gap. So if you speak to most of the countries on the continent, do they have an embedded risk management system that speaks to how they manage the various risks that the population face, and do they have plans to address those risks? So that's really a key problem, because even if you get funding, but if you haven't arranged your framework within the country to assess the risk and respond to the risk, then even if you get the funding, my hypothesis is that you will not be efficient in dealing with the various risks. So we need to establish risk management within the governments as a priority. Then that enables us to deal with the risks. And I also wish that Mark New had spoken first before me, but I'm sure you also hear and you've heard already from other colleagues that the risks are increasing. So what used to be a 1 in 50-year event is now becoming maybe a 1 in 10-year event, or even worse. So what that means is that the cost of insurance is going to be much higher, and in some cases it's not going to be feasible to insure the events that we used to associate as catastrophic, because it just doesn't make sense. So what that means is that we need more funding now to be allocated to contingency funds or reserves that deal with the more frequent events. The only problem is that those more frequent events are now of a huge magnitude, and this is because of climate change. And the other issue that we've also got is that when you look at the population growth that's forecast for the continent, at least 8 to 10 countries are going to experience a doubling in their population to 2050. So what that means is that the exposure is going to increase. The hazards, as we know from climate change, we know that floods, droughts are going to increase in severity. But equally also important, there are going to be new perils that we haven't really spoken about, because they're not really been in the limelight. So here I'm talking about heat waves. A lot of places are going to become unlivable because of the heat. We're also going to see more outbreaks and epidemics, because climate change is going to induce more and more of these things. So from a hazard, it's all going up. From an exposure, it's going up, and from a vulnerability, given all the here and now issues that we're talking about, and the fact that there is no funding, my hypothesis is also that the vulnerability is going to increase. So when you put all these things together.
So, Martin, let me just jump in there. Let me jump in there. You mentioned risk management gap, and that's very important. But what we also know is that insurance is business, and it will flow to where there is a promise of income, which then means that even the most vulnerable, if they are not able to drive enterprises that build their resilience, then definitely they wouldn't be able to pay back, even if they were to be able to have access to insurance. So my question to you is, there is the Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance, which we saw over 85 insurance companies in Africa for the first time commit to creating about 14 billion insurance facility to cover about 1.4 billion citizens against the climate risk that you mentioned, flood, drought, tropical cyclones in the next 27 years. So what would you say, very briefly, so I'll move to the next panelist, that needs to be done at every level so that insurance can optimally respond to build resilience of communities in the continent?
So I think there's a bit that's being done, but it's not enough. And that's really the allocation of funding to vulnerable communities in risk pool. So we are a risk pool. Governments have access to funding that they can use to respond to vulnerable communities, but it's not enough. I think that's really the key thing. But I think that what we also need is to understand that with the 97% protection gap, there's not going to be a single silver bullet. Different interventions have to take place in different circumstances. So you need both micro, meso, as well as the macro insurance to take care of the problem. And then also you also need to build to reduce the vulnerability of people. So people need to be able to rely on other income streams that are not necessarily dependent on agriculture, which is very difficult because more than 60% of the continent on average are involved in agriculture. But this is a multidimensional problem. But of course, the first thing to do is governments need to take advantage of the facilities that are available. especially with risk pools, because there is a lot of money that's not really being used in terms of premium financing. So that's really important. So I'll leave it there. There's so many things I could say, but we don't have time. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Malvin, for actually explaining that in very easy way to understand. I will now move to Prof. And Prof, well, the science is clear, unequivocally clear. And what I would like you to just put in perspective very briefly, do we have enough information? You heard from Richard, he talked about gaps. Well, and there are also gaps that I don't think that scientifically can be measured, confidence and data gap, in addition to the data to effectively identify and quantify loss and damage resulting from climate change. What has been the missing link here that you can be able to tell us? And how are we closing this using the science that we have? Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Richard. So just quickly, my expertise really lies in the attribution of climate change impacts and adaptation. And I wanted to introduce that so that you could understand how this sort of fits into the idea of loss and damage. So what does this attribution of impacts actually mean? I mean, first we need to try and quantify how much the human-driven component of a particular climate impact has contributed to an observed impact, whether that's ecosystem, social, economic. And second, we also try to quantify how much adaptation might have reduced this impact. And that's kind of the residual impact that you would get without adaptation. And that, as Richard was saying, is where loss and damage really sits. It's the residual impacts that would be experienced either because there wasn't money for adaptation, or adaptation couldn't happen, or because you'd reached essentially physical limits to adaptation and there was nothing more you could do. So if we can do that kind of work, then we can actually start to quantify loss and damage in a sensible way, in the way that it's actually framed within the convention. And one of the challenges, I think, at the moment is distinguishing between damage generally from climate risks and the additional damage that comes from human influence on climate. And that's a really, really tricky thing to do. So I think the attribution community has got to the stage where they can really do that reasonably well regarding the hazard itself. So if it's an extreme event or a drought, we kind of have the technical capability to quantify how the risk of that drought has changed, as Malvin was saying. What we don't really have at the moment is the ability to say, what does that mean in terms of on-the-ground damage with and without different levels of adaptation? Because there you need essentially a good understanding at a very local context of how a hazard propagates through into producing impact on the ground, and also understanding of what the levels of adaptation are. Otherwise, you can't really just discuss what loss and damage looks like. So really
Rob, let me just jump in there.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you are bringing up a very important aspect of the knowledge and the data gaps and the understanding of adaptation limits, and also then the linkage to be able to quantify and qualify what is loss and damage, that an attribution to the changing climate. But I just want to bring this up, and I think after this, we will get back to the second round, actually, when we hear from the panel. But I just want to, having known what we know today, why did it take 30 years for this issue to finally come to where it is today, when the science and the knowledge was very clear?
Because, well, one of the challenges has been that the science on attribution started off by just trying to make the case that climate change was happening at a global scale, and actually fighting the disinformation that came from vested interests around, is this something we should worry about? And it's only in the last, I would say, decade that we're able to start to look at attribution at the scale of where the impacts happen. So in a village, in a river basin, so where, at the coalface of adaptation. So the science really has only been fit for purpose, and actually not fit for purpose for all types of hazards, even yet, at the scale where the impact happens. So we're now on the cusp of being able to actually say something useful to inform our understanding of how climate change has contributed to losses and damage. But the final point I wanted to make is that we don't really want to get bogged down into this exact quantification, because everything is so case and site specific that if we get bogged down in trying to figure out exactly what the residual damages are in every particular case, we're going to just get totally bogged down and never actually end up with any relief or financing. So for me, the challenge is how to create general rules, a bit like weather-based index insurance, that allow us to have general rules that are based on science, but then allow for rapid delivery of relief in the case of loss and damage. We don't want to be arguing every single bullet point, of every single context. We need something that works rapidly, efficiently, and is acceptable and reasonably scientifically robust.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Prof, for that, bringing that perspective. And I like the aspect of the attribution. And for us to move away, getting bogged down on whether the science is actually providing perspective to the realities of loss and damage. Now, I'll then get to you, Samuel. Well, Africa is a young continent. And these young people are energetic, they're passionate, they're entrepreneurial, but yet they're at the forefront of loss and damage, and of course, the risk of climate change, as you've heard. What I want to ask you, and I want you to go straight to the point, is have young people been forgotten in the fight to win back against climate change? And if so, what do you think needs to be done?
Okay, thank you so much. And it's been a wonderful conversation so far. So I would say that young people has been forgotten in the fight for climate action in regards to assessing the resources needed for them to, boost up their work. And then from our own end, part of what we've been doing is to take up research to actually understand the concept of loss and damage, especially those in vulnerable communities, and then using some sub-Saharan African countries as case studies where we've discovered how vulnerable they are, their risk and threat vulnerability. And then we've also been able to carry out some systematic reviews in these particular regions to know what their ultimate pressing needs are. So for we young people, the part of our role in this whole thing is trying to provide young people with knowledge to close those knowledge gaps that exist in the climate space, and also organize capacity building trainings and workshops to make sure that they have the right skill and the right ability to address climate change. And this has been a major growth for us. And what we are also looking at in the loss and damage is closing the funding, the gapping limitations that exist in the loss and damage fund, because we've seen situations where the GCF fund, the adaptation fund, part of this fund that may, like the GCF, which we know, according to the report by International World Institute, cited that about 24% of the GCF funds covered loss and damage, but not explicitly. So part of what we as young people are trying to do is to make sure that the loss and damage fund, which we know should be a separate fund, should have a bottom-down approach, where people can be able to have access to this fund directly in local communities, and then without restricting access, without giving them heads up, without giving them barriers.
Yes, Samuel, that's a very good point you're bringing up, and your starting point was that yes, young people have been forgotten, and you have also indicated there is already work that you young people across the continent, including yourself and your organization, are doing. So I want to ask this: the point that you are bringing now, getting to the communities to be able to engage communities, young people, the informal sector. So my question to you is, are these young people prepared? Are their skills being retold? Because even if they have access to finance, do they have the requisite skills? And if not, what are you guys doing to be able to ensure that their risk can be reduced, but at the same time, they have the right skills if they were to get access to finances? Very briefly.
Okay, so I would say young people are prepared, because if you look at most of the initiatives that are being pioneered right now in addressing climate change issues, especially for vulnerable communities, they are being pioneered and, projected by young people in these different communities. And also, if you look at most of the research that have been taken up, is also being handled and headed by young people. So they are well prepared. And part of also what we are doing beyond preparation is also to equip them with the necessary skills needed to move ahead. At times, you know, there could be limitations in the areas of assessing data, assessing information, and apart from that, assessing mentorship support for them to be able to move on. So this is what we are doing from our end. And as young people all over the world, we are already seeing the leadership of young people in addressing climate change issues, looking at locally led adaptation measures to boost local community adaptation capacity. Apart from that, looking at advocacy championed by young people, looking at campaigns. So there's a lot of things young people are doing. But the question that we are actually confronted with is, when are young people going to be invited or onboarded on the decision-making board or decision-making table to take part in the policy process, in the negotiation process? Because at the end of the day, when young people pioneer lots of this initiative, they are always forgotten. They are always at the background, you know, and when the fund comes, it doesn't even flow down. So it's at the peripheral level. And that is what we as young people, we are trying to make sure it doesn't repeat itself, especially with the loss and damage fund. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, the proper preparation prevents poor performance. So from what you are saying means you guys are prepared to make sure that you are part of the table. But always remember, if you are not part of the table, you are part of the menu, and then get a folded chair and set up your own table. I think that is what you are doing. And thank you very much for the great work you are doing across the continent. I will now then get to Oscar to put up questions or the release from the audience so we can be able to get feedback from panelists. And then after that, we'll get back to each panelist to give his last word before we conclude the session in a couple of minutes. Oscar, over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Richard, and thanks again to all these great presentations. I see that we have a few people who raised their hands, so let's first go through these different questions. First, we have Dr. Ala. So Dr. Ala, normally you are now able to speak, so please over to you to ask your questions very briefly. Thanks.
Yes, and keep it briefly, please, because we run out of time. Go ahead, please, straight to the questions.
Hello, do you hear me?
Go ahead, yes, please, straight to the question.
I would like to ask Miss Anna about her presentation. She presented a very interesting presentation, but the presentation involved only two mechanisms, Warsaw International Mechanism and Santiago Network. Why she didn't talk about Sunday framework for disasters also? Thank you very much. I would like to express my happiness that I am here with you all. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ala. That was very brief indeed. And I think we can take 3 questions, Oscar, and then get to colleagues to be able to provide feedback. That will save us time.
Perfect. So then just after that, we have Bob Mentiu. So Bob, normally you are now able to speak. So please formulate your question. Over to you.
Bob, unmute and then go straight to the point.
Yeah, I see that Bob is still muted, unfortunately. So while we're waiting for Bob, let's maybe try to see with Aissata Sisse. Aissata, please, you are now normally able to speak.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Vous me recevez?
Oui, très bien.
Ok, d'accord. Bonjour à tous et à tous les organisateurs. Et franchement, c'est une bonne initiative et les thématiques sont intéressantes. Maintenant, ma contribution, c'était par rapport à la prise en compte des jeunes. C'est un commentaire. Je ne sais pas, est-ce qu'on veut dire que dans les grandes décisions au niveau de la gestion des changements climatiques, qu'on ne voit pas assez de jeunes? Parce qu'il me semble que par rapport aux pertes et préjudices, quand il y a les questions d'inondation, généralement, les jeunes sont au centre dans la résolution. C'est eux qui aident les parents à pouvoir évacuer rapidement, à pouvoir s'adapter de façon continuelle. Donc, pour moi, à ce niveau, ils sont là. Sauf si on pense que dans nos débats de haut niveau sur les questions de changement climatique, est-ce qu'ils sont insuffisamment absents? Voilà la problématique que je voulais comprendre dans le cadre de la prise en compte des jeunes. Merci beaucoup et merci à vous tous. Je suis très ravi.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, thank you very much, Asita, for bringing up that aspect, which is noted. And I think Samuel did bring that up. And actually, the youth are not only the drivers of climate and loss and damage, but they are actually the epicenter and they cannot be ignored. Thank you very much. I think, Oscar, we might be able to read comments from the chat so that at least we can get those to panelists to be able to give perspective.
Yes, we already answered more than 100 questions, and a big thanks to all the panelists. I'm just going to try and see if Bob is available one more time. Bob, maybe try to unmute yourself now and ask your question. Otherwise, if Bob is still unable to unmute, I'll then go to Akwe Abul. Akwe, over to you. And then after that, we can start answering the questions. Thanks. Akwe, over to you.
All right. Good afternoon.
Go straight to the question, please.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is going to the panelists. Looking at the fund that is established, the loss and damage fund, and other funding entities that were actually established, how sure are we that it will not fall under the socio-political dimension of climate change that is happening between the global south and north, on them seeing that any fund that is established for adaptation actually favors only the global south. So how are they going to ensure that this particular fund will be able to benefit or the essence of the establishment? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abul. I think with these three questions, we can get answers from colleagues. I think the first question was to Anne. Anne, if you can intervene, the question from Dr. Allah to answer his question.
So with the very limited time and being that I come from the UNFCCC Secretariat, I have focused my presentation only on the developments under the UNFCCC. So of course, a lot of things that are very relevant to loss and damage, like disaster risk reduction, have been partially left out. But I would also like to underline that one of the expert groups of the UNEP-GAN, which is the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management, is quite active on comprehensive risk management approaches, which of course are very much linked with disaster risk reduction. And UNDRR is also part of that expert group. So there's quite a bit of linkages with the Sendai framework and the disaster risk aspects. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. And then the question on youth. Only involved at operational level in supporting communities, but not at strategic level. I think all the panelists, can you provide in 30 seconds each a response to that, just rapidly? I'll start off with Madame Adama Alezi. 1 minute.
Allô? Allô? Allô?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, on can hear you.
Revenez sur la question, s'il vous plaît. Le réseau balance.
Are you ensuring that youth are engaged at a strategic level in your country to be part of these loss and damage discussions? Very briefly, please, 1 minute.
Oui, pour garantir l'implication des jeunes au niveau de mon pays, dans les pertes et préjudices, dans la gestion des pertes et préjudices, je pense que il faut jouer sur les questions d'ordre politique, parce que il faut qu'il y ait une volonté politique par rapport à l'implication de ces jeunes d'abord, qu'il y ait la volonté politique des autorités concernant l'implication des ONG dans la gestion de ces crises. C'est vrai que nous sommes en train de parler de l'implication déjà chez nous ici. Les jeunes sont impliqués à travers les ONG qui interviennent en cas d'inondation, en cas de feu de brousse, en cas, je ne sais pas, en tout cas, en cas de perte et préjudice. Ce sont les jeunes qui sont les premiers à être sur les lieux parce que ce sont les jeunes qui sont solides par rapport aux personnes âgées. Mais sur le plan institutionnel, il faut une volonté politique des autorités de la place pour que les jeunes soient mieux impliqués dans la situation de gestion des dommages.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Madam Adama. That was really great. I think I'll get to Richard Shiman, my namesake, on this question from Mr. Abdul. That how sure are we that loss and damage fund will benefit those that it's been targeted? If you can use 30 seconds just to give an answer to that, then I'll get to the panelists with their final word so that we start to run up.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And it's an important question, but part of it is not going to be resolved right now by the transitional committee. It will be resolved by the board of the fund and the systems it puts in place to ensure accountability of finances. Right now, the preference is for money to go directly through direct budget support or policy-based support to national governments, but we understand that there has to be a separate, distinct channel to give money to communities, and therefore this is why some of the existing institutions won't be able to do that. So it might be actually easier to create new mechanisms in the new institutions to deliver these things. And again, it's a question of management and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a question of management and accountability. And Samuel, I'm coming to you, and this is your last word. You heard question of management and accountability. How do you think that countries can be accountable to the youth, as well as also the youth accountable when it comes to actions? 1 minute.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. Countries can be accountable for the youth through creation of or establishment of a policy framework that aligns people's thoughts and will into a particular perspective. And by so doing as well, it goes back to the youth also being accountable, because part of what we are also pushing as youth for the Loss and Damage Fund is establishment of a policy framework that holds leaders accountable, and also that ensures that these funds are being tracked, they are transparent, and we don't have to hear stories of people making promises and not being fulfilled. So through policy framework and also through tracking of these funds, we believe that there can be accountability across both sectors between the youth and the government. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes. My question to Dr. Luz Fongso and to Prof. and Mr. Marvin is, recently, you must have heard in the news, His Excellency President Ruto of Kenya, the chair of the Committee of African Head of State, during the just ended summit for the new Global Financial Pact towards the realization of Agenda 2030, he underscored the need for a global financial tax where countries pay commensurate to their economies and where the fund is managed by an organization of equals to ensure fair access to financing for sustainable low carbon development. What is your take on this? 1 minute.
All right, thank you. I'll go first. Thank you very much, Richard. And I thought that idea by President Ruto was very important, because if you create a loss and damage fund that you expect developed countries to put money into it, then they have to accept a legal liability for them to be responsible. And Richard Sherman we can argue this later on, and I want to be blunt here. They would never accept any liability in order to be able to say they are financially responsible. However, if we create a mechanism where the global emission industries and sectors can be taxed, and you put that money into a fund, adaptation fund, we'll be talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and managed entirely. So when you think about funding arrangement, it's important for us to be able to think out of the box. That's the one. Number two, it's also very important to understand that we've done some things well. We've created enormous financing and investment in early warning systems. What we haven't done is early actions matching those systems. So you have to be able to respond quickly based on something. So we know when the next drought is going to happen. The question is, what are we going to do ahead of that time? And that's where you have the critical mass of young people, young entrepreneurs, bringing ideas and innovations together to be able to be part of the body of solution. and that global finance can trigger that. I'll keep you there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would then now move to Marvin. You've heard early action will make the difference.
Sorry, is it just me or we lost Richard?
Yes, I think Richard, you froze.
Okay. One for me as well. Yeah.
Let's see if Richard is coming back soon.
I'm sure you got his question.
Please, all right, Richard, you're back on.
Richard,
yes, sorry, I think I was saying, Marvin, what's your take on what the president said? And given that you've heard from Dr. Lufonso, he said early action is what is missing, given the scale of the crisis.
I think it's a combination of early action funding as well as accountability, because and for me, and that's why I always talk about the risk management gap, because governments, are, in my own view, are not doing enough to embed disaster risk management as part of their responsibilities, and they're not accountable. So, you know, people cannot be, you know, I know there's a funding gap, but we need accountability first. And then that proposal by President Ruto is very useful, because it will enable a smooth transfer and flow of funds to address, you know, the current financing gap. So yes, but I think those two are very important, you know, in terms of, you know, the accountability, the flow of funds, you know, those are useful precedents. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Prof, do you agree with that? Briefly.
I think one of, certainly the fewer strings and conditionalities that are attached to funding enables much more flexibility and probably more rapid delivery. But I also think it's almost artificial to separate out adaptation funding and loss and damage funding, because the two are kind of flip sides of the same coin. And so one has to be thinking in terms of climate financing on the risk reduction side of those in a much more integrated way than perhaps the architecture allows us to at the moment. Why do we have a separate loss and damage fund from an adaptation fund? Why are we not thinking about integrated climate risk reduction and risk management and financing? So I know we're victim of kind of the architectures we live with, but it does seem to then mean that you're ending up with a very imperfect way of allocating resources in the ways that are most appropriate for different contexts.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thanks a lot. Amazing panelists and presenters for this discussion today. Very, very important. We've heard, and the message is quite very clear, that the scale and speed needs to match the reality. And from this discussion, what is coming out very clear is that loss and damage is not something that is happening tomorrow, it's happening today. But the enabling policy environment to incentivize youth action to ensure that insurance can actually establish risk management and assessment to enable effective, impactful coverage with funds is needed. Hazards and exposure and vulnerability that is increasing means that insurance needs to flow where there is promise of incomes. And this is quite very, very important. But the aspect of distinguishing loss and damage with climate change and from human-induced action, what we actually heard and understood is that understanding adaptation limits and understanding also misinformation regarding attribution of impact, limitations of science, and challenge of creating general rules that are acceptable and within science backing is quite very, very important. Where the young people, very crucial in the process, and that they are not just sitting idling and asking for funds, but they are playing a role. And leveraging on the ingenuity can make us to move forward, but they must be part and parcel of decision making. We heard very clearly that we cannot be able to move forward without actually closing gaps, from financial gaps to trust gaps and to confidence gaps. And overarchingly, the enabling environment to move forward needs to be created so that we can build resilience and at the same time tap into opportunities. But one interesting aspect is early actions are always better than actions later. We now come to the close of our discussion and I'll hand over to Oscar say a word as we run up. Oscar, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And of course, thanks a lot to all the different panelists. And thanks again, Richard, for the great moderation. So as I've already mentioned, we received a lot of questions through the Q&A. We answered already more than 120 of them, but there are still a few that haven't been answered. So please rest assured, we will make sure to come back to you by email and answer these different questions. So a big thanks again to all the participants for taking the time and for your active participation. It has been really great. And we will make sure, of course, to also share with all of you the recordings, some of the key takeaways from the discussions, and more information about what is happening in the region in terms of loss and damage very soon. So a big thanks to all of you and wishing you all a great rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And do have a lovely evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
I just want to come in a quick reminder. There is a global goals adaptation webinar happening next week, and we look forward to welcoming you then. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for the reminder. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Merci, au revoir et à la prochaine.
Au revoir.
Merci.
Merci.